We're still in Hebrews.
There we go.
Did you know that? What I'll do today is I'm not going to give a huge introduction, but we'll kind of continue. We've been continuing with chapter 6, and we stopped at 6:8, but we're going to really quickly go through part of 6. But I don't see anybody that's really new, but I want to remind you for some things. You know, the purpose of the class, we look at historical, linguistic, and cultural understanding for the book. The point of Hebrews is to understand what it says in the Greek and what it means historically. But anything else, that's homework. You can do whatever you want with the other stuff, right? We don't touch the theology and doctrine. If you ask theological or doctrinal questions, I'll try to answer them from a historical standpoint, because that's the point, right? I mean, all this, 2,000 years of Christianity, and it'd be nice to know how things work, right? Or it's supposed to work. The authors of this book, and if you notice, we've come to a conclusion. I tried to point it out. I hope I pointed out well. There are about 4 or 5 places in Hebrews where the author calls themselves we. And so I put that in as a teaser, right? I told you we don't know who wrote this document. I told you it sounds a little bit like maybe Alexander, the guy, not Alexander, what's his name? Apollos, Paul's friend. But it is possible, we think that Apollos may have been the author, but maybe Apollos and Barnabas. That's kind of a lot of the thinking today. But what we'll do is when we finish the book, we'll see I hope we have some time left over at the end of that's probably like maybe the 6th or whatever, since we're at 6, maybe longer than that. Anyway, when we get to the very end, what we'll do is we'll review what we've seen and then try to make a historical determination of actually who probably wrote these. But it's definitely not Paul. Why can't it be Paul? Why can't Paul have written this document?
Too many differences. He doesn't sign off at the end like the Alex did. He doesn't have the same type of greeting.
Yeah, the styles are different.
The style is different, that kind of thing. That's what we've said. But the big deal, the real big deal is, when did Paul croak it? Paul was dead by 55 AD, right? His first book was written in Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians in 52 AD. Traditionally, 55 AD, he's gone. This book is most likely written
70 or after.
Yeah, why?
Destruction of the temple.
Yeah, 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem. So at least 70 AD, because what was the big deal in 70 AD that caused excitement in the history of the world of that period? The Jews were fleeing to Jerusalem because the temple was destroyed. Nero died, I think, in 69, didn't he? But Nero started this. It's Nero's fault. Nero was a psycho anyway. I mean, he was really a nuthead. Probably too much lead in his wine, right? But he was whacked. He was really... So, but what got him mad? Does anybody know historically what got him mad at Jerusalem? The high priest in Jerusalem decided to do something really stupid. What they had done before is they had offered offerings in the temple for the Roman Empire and for the Roman emperor. Not in the name of, not as is their God, but for them, right? And because of Nero's policies to the Jews and to Teen Hodos. Matter of fact, Soitnus. Soitnus is one of the earliest declarations in Latin that we have about Christ, because Soitnus says that Nero kicked all of the Mysterions, including Christus, the Mysterion of Christus, out of Rome. So in retaliation, the priests in Jerusalem thought they were really being smart, and what they did is they said, we're not going to do any more sacrifices in the name of Nero or the emperor or Rome. And how did Nero take that? Nero thought he was the embodiment of, well, he thought he competed. We don't do this anymore. Okay, we have so degenerated. What did the Olympics include back in the day of Greece?
Running, wrestling.
Sacrifice.
They ran around naked, yeah, they had sacrifices, but what was the main part of it? The main part of it that they should be teaching you in school, because this is direct history, is they had poetry contests and play contests, right? Because the Olympics, the Greeks, remember a gymnasium was not a gymnasium, it's a gymnasium, and the gymnasium was about intellect and learning, and also about, building your strength and muscles. They had 3 different types of schools. Remember? We've talked about this before. They had a gymnasium. In a gymnasium, you went to build your muscles and to build your brains. So that's the Greek worldview. The Greek worldview is you do all that. God, by the way, they did sacrifices in the gymnasium, for the gymnasium. That was the Palestera, which is mistranslated in a lot of ancient texts. But they actually did sacrifices for those who were in the gymnasium. And the gymnasium was a place where you learned about God, and learned about literature, and about history and all that other stuff. And you built your muscles up, and you learned to be an Olympian, right? Olympic type guy. And then when you went to the Olympics, what did you compete in? Poetry, plays, and athletics.
The guy who started the modern Olympics wanted to revive that too, actually. He had like a poetry and art and whatever competition, but it didn't really catch on, and so after a short period of time it just died away. But yeah.
That's because our athletics guys are too stupid, or what? What?
ABC Sports wouldn't cover it.
Yeah, ABC Sports would not cover the poetry, So yeah. ESPN would definitely not cover it, right? So anyway, but Nero competed in the poetic games at the Olympians, at the Olympic ceremonies. He was a competitor, and apparently he didn't do that well, but he always got the prize. Right? So anyway, they stopped the sacrifice, and Nero got very upset about that, and so basically he surrounded the walls of Jerusalem and defeated Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. That was the reason. Now he was dead, but information travels slow, plus I guess that was a fun thing to do, right? Anyway, so they followed along with his will. But that diaspora was a diaspora of Teen Hodos, right? And the Jews, and they went to, where'd they go? Well, we believe that a huge number went to Alexandria. Why did they go to Alexandria? This is a review, but good functional review, right? So they went from Jerusalem. You guys remember the 4 schools of Judaism, right? This is important. Babylon, the Galil, and Alexandria. Now, why did they go to Alexandria?
Because
they were sacrificing there.
There was a temple there and sacrificing. Now, this doesn't seem like a very positive thing, right, for Orthodox type of Jews. But how Orthodox were these guys?
Hellenized.
some of them not really.
Well, they were messed up from the...
Yeah, they had the priests were from the wrong line and everything, and it was the Essenes who were all mad about it and trying to do their own thing and be pure, and the others just kind of had already messed up stuff, so.
That's right. It's like today, right? We see the same thing happening today. The Essenes had broken off because the Maccabees were not in the lineage of Levi, right? Or not in the lineage of Aaron. So they made, the Maccabees made the high priest to be not in the lineage of Aaron. And that was a problem. The Essenes said, we're taking our ball and going, right? And then the Essenes broke the law because they sacrificed to God using their high priest. They had the high priest. You believe it was Jonathan the high priest and kept the high priest line going. But we know what happened to those guys, right? What happened to the Essenes?
They got killed on top of that mountain.
Yeah, they were killed by the Romans because they were part of that group I write about it in my book Centurion. You know, there were, I call them the blue shawls, but they were really that kind of group. But they were rebelling against Rome to a degree, but whether they were or not, that didn't matter. The ones that survived became Teen Hodos. Because we know that Jesus...
Became or joined?
What's that?
You said became. Did they became or did they join?
Well, that's a great question. They joined Teen Hodos because it was, you know, part of the thing. They believed that it was a lineage. Right? That's something we see in Acts. Remember it says in Acts that many of the high priests, many of the priests came to Teen Hodos? You know, you can't ignore that, right? I mean, this is a historical fact. One of the problems and one of the reasons the Essenes don't exist is probably because most of the Essenes that didn't continue their rebellion were subsumed into Teen Hodos. And huge groups were subsumed into Teen Hodos. Matter of fact, what would be your guess about Judaism in this period?
It wasn't a real strong period for Judaism.
But what was happening to Teen Hodos?
Getting stronger.
Well, when it says in Acts that many of the priests became members of Teen Hodos, and remember what it says about in Acts about, it says about those who weren't Jews. 1/3 said, forget it. 1/3 said, I'd like to hear more about it. And 1/3 said, I'm joining. Right? Well, how do you think that worked with Jews?
Yeah, because the Gentiles are unclean and you don't want to associate with them.
Well, I was thinking about how many. Like when Paul, you know, we don't have records of how many Jews came to Teen Hodos when Paul preached. But what's your guess?
Didn't you say it was up to 1/3 maybe at one point?
I'm guessing it was higher than that. The reason I would say it's higher than that, what happened? Okay, if you're having lots of success, what does the leadership do? They push back, right? How much pushback is there in Acts against Teen Hodos?
A lot.
It's a lot,
Thrown in
right?
jail every other day.
Yeah, especially from the Jews, right? The Jews were really pressing against, in fact, the Jews and the Gentiles, because remember in Ephesus they had that huge riot because of it, right? And we know that Soitanus writes not that, you know, he doesn't say the Mysterion of Pythagoras, the Mysterion of this, he says Mysterions and the Mysterion of Christus.
He's the most noteworthy one then, I suppose.
Bingo! Yeah. This stuff is all beautiful, like historical kind of stuff. Yes, sir.
So there's this rift growing, and you said Nero had kicked them out of Rome, the Mysterians and Christus out of Rome. Why would the Jerusalem, the church, the high priests, stop sacrificing to Nero in support of them? If there's this rift going, I think they would be happy.
Because in Acts it says many of the priests came to become Teen Hodos, number one. And number two, because along with the Mysterions, he was kicking the Jews out too. So what we see is a lot of this, historically you have to read between the lines, right? We're going to see a little bit more of this. But I just wanted to bring us up to speed because Hebrews was written most likely to the Alexandrianites, right? It should have been called the letter to the Alexandrianites, but it's called the letter to the Hebrews. But it's very obvious that this is written to the Jews, or I would say all the groups in Alexandria. And so
The general, I mean, what I've always heard was Paul had written Hebrews. Is that pretty much what's taught usually?
yeah,
I've got an older Bible that has the, Hebrews according to Paul, but I don't know when that, but it's obvious he did.
Old Bibles did.
what's that?
Old Bibles did.
Attributed.
Paul's letter to the Hebrews, I think
Yeah,
what they call it,
yeah.
right?
know when he died.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you got to remember
This
this.
isn't from the 1800s, it's probably from the 50s.
Yeah.
So.
Well, who didn't like Hebrews?
Martin Luther did.
Martin Luther did not like Hebrews. Martin Luther did not like Hebrews, James, Jude, 2 Peter, and Revelation. There were 5 books that he wanted to make apocryphal. Remember what he did with the Old Testament apocryphal books? He really hurt us. Because Martin Luther took the Old Testament apocryphal books based on what the Jewish Council of Jamnia supposedly said, and remove them from the Old Testament and put them into the Apocrypha. I think that was a disservice to us because those were our interlinking books between the Old Testament and New Testament era. And so he did that on purpose, and that's why it isn't generally in our Bibles today. But he also didn't like those 5 books, and he wanted to make them apocryphal also from the New Testament. But guess what he got? Everybody else said, no way, Jose, we aren't doing that. In fact, the Anglicans and the Catholics still hold the apocryphal books in the Old Testament Apocrypha to be canon. And so does the Orthodox. Guess who the only people that don't really, well, we're supposed to hold it as canon, kinda-ish, right? But guess what camp we're in? We're in the Baptist Methodist Church of Christ camp, right? But all the other liturgical Orthodox churches, Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican, all those guys basically uphold it. But it's the Calvinists that don't. The Calvinists, the Baptists, that whole group does not. So the rift was a huge rift, and Martin Luther had some pushback, and so one of the reasons why they wanted to attribute to Paul, can you guess?
To keep it.
To keep it, yeah. But it's obviously not written by Paul. It can't be. And it's not, look, we find this to be, in the modern era, this is the way you attack the church, right? Well, you guys said it was attributed to Paul. Well, that's not true. In all the ancient documents, it was not attributed to Paul. It was only later that it was attributed to Paul, right? But yet the expert, right, theologians at the church, at this thing say, oh, well, there's a question, right? And so that makes a question in the mind of believers. There's no question. And we've already looked at the historical veracity of the document, right? It has historical veracity. So you just can't throw it out. You have to attribute it to somebody, and just because it's not attributed doesn't mean you just say, well, forget it, right? Martin Luther didn't like it because he didn't like the theology and doctrine in it, which probably means it's more reason for us to study it, in my opinion, because obviously, I don't know. Martin Luther, why throw it out when we had it for 1,000 years, right? Or actually 1,500 years. So, just saying. Anyway, we're not sure who wrote it, but we're guessing, and that's the thing. At least we know there's probably 2. We've seen that. Alexandria, because that was the focus of Teen Hodos in the diaspora, from both Babylon and Jerusalem. And also, well, why wouldn't they go to Galileo? Why wouldn't they go to Babylon? Carthaginians, man, these guys, okay. You think the Romans are rough? You do not want to be caught with the Carthaginians. Those are not happy people, right? They're the Scythians. They're the guys that run around on horses going crazy, and eventually, not quite, but almost the Genghis Khan types. I mean, that's really a happy life. So that's not where you want to go. A lot of Jews were moving out of Babylon even in that period. Why do you want to go to Galileo?
Going towards the Roman Empire, right?
Well, the thing about the Galileo is their philosophy. The Galileo guys, those are the guys that were very stilted in their viewpoint from the Mishnah and from the Torah. So that they're the ones who said, well, you can divorce your wife for any reason. Right? That was that group. And so this group were like, no, that doesn't make sense. And the Alexandrians, what do you think they thought? They're doing sacrifice in their own temple.
They're willing to bend the rules a little, seems like.
Bingo. They're willing to bend the rules a little bit. And by the way, what do we know historically about Christianity in Alexandria? It was huge. This is the extension in North Africa. There were 2 huge bodies. There's actually 3, and eventually there was 2 huge ones. But there was a huge construct of Christianity in North Africa. North Africa was enormous. What caused it to go away? Islam basically destroyed Christianity in North Africa. Christianity, if you go through North Africa, what will you see everywhere? No, monasteries. Everywhere there are monasteries in ruins. But you're right. There are mosques now. And what happened in Turkey, they took churches, Hagia Sophias, and turned them into mosques. So it's the desolation. Abomination of desolation happened before this. It happened in the temple, but that's another abomination of desolation if you like it. The Jews were focused in the Torah, the Tanakh, and the Mishnah. So when you look at, okay, these groups, we have the Jews, and that includes Teen Hodos, because Teen Hodos is the fifth sect of Judaism. So Teen Hodos is part of the Jews. You have the Jews, they're into the Torah, Tanakh, and the Mishnah. That's huge. And it's really huge in Alexandria. Alexandria was so happy because what did they do? What did they do with the Mishnah in Jerusalem and Babylon? Remember? They wrote it down. And what do you think happened when they went to Alexandria?
Took it with them.
They brought it with them. Okay? And when they brought it with them, well, Shazam! What did the Alexandrians like more than anything?
Books, their library.
Books. Yeah, remember libraries, the average library has 7 works in it, right? But they had bigger libraries, maybe 50, right? So Alexandria was big time into books and reading, and that was the intellectual capital. So the Jews were into that, and so that was just a natural place for them to go. And by the way, how interested was Teen Hodos in books?
I have letters from
Reading.
Paul, so I would say.
Their Bible, their letters.
Well, we have a thing called the New Testament, right?
Yep.
How many, well, the Mithrans. How many of you guys have a copy of all the Mithrin books? How many are there? How about the books of Zeus? The books of the Greek gods, or the books of the Roman gods? Plutarch Lives is around, right? Plutarch wrote about people. So the most vibrant intellectual group at the time, this is, you probably didn't hear this in your college classes, but the most intellectual group around at the time happened to be Teen Hodos. The proof is in the pudding, because there are 44 Gospels. There are only 6 extant. We know there are 44 Gospels. 6 extant. 6 existing. That's the ones we know of. Now, how many other letters and documents do you think were written in that era? A lot, and we don't have them. We only have the ones that just happen to be protected and, kept. Other groups don't have anything. So it shows the intellectual vigor. There's huge intellectual vigor. The Greeks, what do the Greeks care about?
Philosophy. Knowledge.
Knowledge, philosophy. Boy, they're in the same camp, right?
Yeah.
And what do you think they think? Well, we know what they thought about the Jews. They loved the Jews, right? Because they had all these ancient documents. What do you think they thought about Teen Hodos?
Probably similar.
Teen Hodos is writing books. Look, how many books do you think came out? Today, every day there's 100 books that come out, right? And the bestseller list, they have it. How many books do you think came out per year in the ancient world?
Not very many.
Maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, right? So maybe there's 4. So you got 4 new books to read. What do you think of the intellectual Greeks in the, whoa, a new book, right? Cool stuff. Of course, you had to be rich enough to have a book slave and buy them, etc., etc. How about the Romans?
Doxa.
They're into building things and taking things and
Engineers.
conquering things. And
Who do they love? Not exactly that way, but they love the Greeks. They love the Greek everything. They love the Greeks so much that they copied. And so, whatever the Greeks were doing, what did the Romans do?
better.
Hey, their version.
Yeah, their version
They
better,
have all
right?
the gods,
Right?
The Greek gods.
And finally, we have the Egyptians. What are the Egyptians into?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The afterlife. The afterlife.
Yeah.
Like it.
They're into death. Now, just a real quick one. I thought this is really interesting. So, the Jews believe that the body, to the Jews, the body is,
Sorry.
remember? Adam and Nephesh. Adam and Nephesh. Nephesh is the breath. Adam is a part. How about the Greeks? Sarx, Psuche, and Pneuma. Okay, how about the Romans?
Probably that, sorry.
Same thing as the Greeks.
Whatever the Greeks said.
Yeah.
Whatever the Greeks said is okay, right? I mean, the Romans did not take time to think about this
Just
stuff.
different
It's too
names.
much work, right?
Call it something different.
Yeah, nothing different. Okay, now I actually, remember I told you, I'll tell you, I looked it up to make sure that we had it, because I told you the Egyptians were different. And I got the list here. They had Ren, Ka, Ib, Ba, and Shiut. You go, holy smoke, how could you get that? Now I really love this. The Ren is a name. The Ka is the same as Nefesh. It's the breath. It'd be kind of similar to Suke a little bit-ish. The Ib is the soul. This is kind of close to Pneuma. The Ba is motivation. Motivation. The motivating force of life. And Shoot is the shadow or image. So your shadow, or like if you make an image like a statue, is a shoot of you. Now, here's something really important. This is reading history between the lines. If you have shoot as an image or shadow, what does that mean?
We're created in the image of God.
Or you're remembered,
This is simple. Just think simple. What does it mean you've developed?
reputation, worth remembering.
If this is an image, like a painting or a statue or even your shadow, what does that mean I've invented?
Language.
We'll get there. It means I've invented statues and paintings, right?
Art.
That's why I say it's simple. Yeah, I've got art. I basically have, at the very least, I have statues. So if I believe that's, if your image is you, that means I've already invented statues. I have statues, which we know they did, right? Okay, they had art and statues. And by the way, in later things, when you see the mummies, what did they put paint on the mummies? Their faces. That was late, though. That was after the Greeks. Very interesting. Because who brought them painting? The Romans. The Byzantines brought them painting. And so once they got painting, it was like a lot easier to do. I mean, look, mummies' faces are really strange, right? So they had the masks, but later on they could paint them. What does it mean that you have a name as one of your primary aspects of a human being?
Personal identity.
Personal identity, but what does it mean you've invented?
Literacy?
You've invented literacy, and it's common literacy. Because, okay, in an ancient tribe, if I have a name, right, my name can change and shift from, time to time as I age or grow, right? And that happens. We know that happens. However, in the Egyptian, what does this mean? When I give you a name, it's permanent and it's written. I can write your name. Back to the point of, you guys know this, right? That they put all names in hieroglyphics in a symbol like this, and they write it within it. And that is how we know they were names, is because they would put the names in this Ankh kind of symbol, right?
Don't they call it cartouches? I mean, didn't we used to
Yes.
buy those all, for a souvenir?
They're cartouches, and they have power. And somebody knows your name, they have power over you, right? What do we do in baptism? What do you do in the mikveh bath when you become Jewish? What did they do?
Say your name.
Not just say your name, they give you your name, right? In baptism, when we baptize a kid, we've lost this idea, but we are actually christening with you with your name. Where do you think these ideas came from? Where did the children of Israel live, right?
Yeah, Egypt.
Catholics used to give names. We had one lady in the class that she was married Catherine something or other at her baptism.
Yes.
So when
Did
did
they
that
get
stop?
a name at confirmation?
Well, you're supposed to. Yeah. You're supposed to get your permanent name at baptism. Yeah, and Merrick, that's what, who else does this? Islam. Muslims do the same thing. When you're baptized as a Muslim, you are given a Muslim name. likewise, when you're baptized as a Christian, you're supposed to be given a Christian name, or you select a Christian name, right?
Even ancient Indians.
This is very interesting because this is not what the Greeks, even though the Greeks were literate and very highly literate, that wasn't their view. This view did not come from the Greeks. This view came, obviously, from the Egyptians. And guess what? I think it got empowered because Teen Hodos was in Alexandria, where they were with the Egyptians. So, I know this is, this book itself is very interesting because is this early? Is this an early view of Christianity? No, it's a late view of Christianity in the first century. We're talking about 70 AD. This is when the views have become settled. I would say settled very strongly. So Hebrews is a wonderful document because it takes all the other documents and kind of wraps them up into a piece. And so that's why it's so philosophical. Of course, we know it's a logos to telos, and that's what we'll get to. So let's see what we can do here and at least catch up in our ideas and knowledge.
Was it considered a name that you earned that they gave you based on your life experiences? Now this is the name that we think fits you better than the name you were given as a child? Or?
Not in the Egyptian worldview. In the Egyptian worldview and the worldview, for example, of Islam and Christianity, well, Islam copied Christianity, right? Christianity copied the Jewish, came right out of the Jewish idea. The Jewish idea was you were given your name because you were given your Jewish name. It was a symbol to you. And it may have been chosen, you might have helped choose it, but in general, it was probably chosen for you to fit you, right? And so Christianity did the same thing, right? We choose a name, or you're chosen a name to fit you as a Christian, right? And it's not, and it becomes a permanent thing. How permanent is your name today?
Cradle to grave.
Yeah, and how hard is it to change it? I mean,
You have
most
to
of the
go through
time.
a legal process.
Yeah, you have to go through a totally legal process to even change it. So guess what? Our whole culture and society has taken on whose worldview?
Christian.
A Christian worldview that comes from the Jewish, which comes from the Egyptian worldview. I think this is important because you know what we tend to do? What do we tend to do with all this good historical stuff?
Forget about it.
Yeah, it was in the past. Who cares about those Egyptians? They were dummies, right? Dumb Egyptians, they believed in the Ren, the Ba, the Ka, that's just stupid, right? And the Greeks, they believed in Sarksuke and Pneuma. There's no Sarksuke and Pneuma. You're just a bag of bones and DNA, right? That's it. You're just chemicals, right? If you ignore the past, what have you done?
You're crumbling your foundation.
There is no civilization, right? Yeah, crumbling your foundation. Yeah, don't the Taliban destroy statues?
Yeah.
Just
And
saying, the
ancient
history they don't like.
monuments and everything.
Yeah, and books and just destroy the history, right? Why have any of it? If you notice history, everything comes to everything. It's all related in history. It's beautiful. Anyway, I've got some words of the day, probably too many. This is Kausin, Hausen. Let's see, and I got my notes. I gave you notes too. This is really simple. This just means to set on fire. From kael means to set on fire, to be burned. Oh, here's one of our favorite words. My favorite word is telos. Comes from telo. This means it's mistranslated all the time. It means specifically a limit or a goal. And I think I've drawn over and over for you. This is what a telos. This is a telos right here. It's the projection of a shadow onto. Well, it means more than that in Greek, but it is a shadow. But in an argument, it's the unstated telos, the unstated conclusion, so to speak. This is Katas. No. What's that? That's an R. R-A-S. Kataras. This is a really interesting word. Kata means down. It's not a very bright pen. Down. And this is really interesting. This word means to pray. This is one of the only words that's even close to pray. It means, it comes from the word, and I've got the notes in there for you. Comes from the word ara, from ario. Ario means to lift up, and ara means to raise the voice up to the heavens. It also can mean to sail away, and it says by Hebraism to expiate sin, but that's not a very good one. Anyway, this word is properly prayer in Greek. So aras, or aria, is prayer. Aria, prayer. Also a song in English that's a prayer. Aria means to pray. Kata means to down pray, which means to curse. So it's the opposite of prayer. Very interesting. In other words, to cast a prayer down. Aegis. E-G-G-U-S. Aegis. To squeeze or throttle. You notice that it says from at hand, near, nigh. But squeeze or throttle the neck is kind of a little more, let's just say it's kind of translated. Would you say that translating this as near is kind of a bad translation? Yeah. Aegis is a very powerful word in Greek, and it's mistranslated usually near. Anyway, what I want to do is I want to very quickly as we can, go through the first part of chapter 6. And then I'm not going to stop very much here if we can. Chapter 6:1. Therefore let us send forth the elementary, the chief teachings, logos, logical argument about Christ, and bear or carry to maturity, not throwing down. Let me see. Instead of doing this, I'll read my translation. Therefore, let us send forth the chief logical argument about Christ, and bear as a completer, not throwing down anew the foundation of repentance from dead work and persuasion about God. I'll read that again. This is the translation I gave you before. Therefore, let us send forth the chief logical argument about Christ, and bear as a completer, not throwing down anew the foundation of repentance from dead work and persuasion about God. 2, teaching immersion, laying on of hands, the stand up again of the dead, and perpetual decision. Perpetual decision. Literally, perpetual meaning judgment. They translate judgment, which is incorrect. Perpetual decision. And I think I mentioned this. What perpetual decision means, you may have seen it in some churches. You may have seen it in your own church. Do you know how some people, Martin Luther wrote about it. Some people say, I can't remember my baptism. I can't remember this. I can't remember that. And therefore, I don't feel like I'm saved. Have you heard that before?
There's a lot of feelings in Protestantism.
Yes, there's a lot of feelings in Protestantism, and we are Protestants. And one of the things that Martin Luther worried about, and that's why Martin Luther writes in the Catechism, the large and small Catechism, what does he say you should do every day? Remember your baptism. Think back on your baptism, right? Because and you're supposed to do the sign of the cross at least 3 times a day, right? So that you remind yourself of who you belong to. Because your name was given to you, that's permanent with God, in your baptism, right? I mean, I'm just throwing that in. But this is absolutely true. This is the point. So one of the things that I believe they obviously had a problem with even now was this idea of perpetual decision. In other words, people who would constantly worry about their salvation, and therefore not feel you can't be effective if you're worried about your salvation, right? Because that leads you to think about what almost every college, I guess, theologian almost seems to be worried about. They don't worry about God at all. Who cares about God? He's a figment, right? That's what the view is. So perpetual decision leads to some pretty bad apostasy. 3, we will do if God changes his mind. In other words, God can't change his mind. It's not possible. 4, not capable, one who time shed rays, tasted the above the heaven's sacrificial gift, who became sharers of Hagios Pneuma. In other words, There's no need to worry about any of that as long as you have shed rays, that means participated in the service, tasted the heaven's sacrificial gift, which is Eucharist, and became sharers of the Hagios Pneuma. 5. And tasted the beautiful story of God, the force of the ages purpose. I love this. And tasted the beautiful story of God, the force of the ages purpose. In other words, what are they talking about tasting? In English, what would we say about tasting the beautiful story of God? In English, we'd say,
Reading the Word of God.
well, yeah, it's figurative, right?
Yeah.
What does it mean to the Greeks?
Consume it?
What's that?
Consume?
Yeah, they're literally consuming the Eucharist, and by consuming the Eucharist, what are they doing?
Becomes a part of it. Consuming it.
Yeah, they are literally tasting the beautiful story of God, the force of the age. And this stuff is, you can't make this up. I mean, look at how powerful this is, right? I mean, and not just powerful. How complex an idea is this? This is not simplistic thinking at all. The view that they would like you to believe, the view that the average, you go to school, right? And what do they say about the documents in the New Testament? Oh, they're simple Greek. Oh, they're Koine Greek. Oh, they're not very complex. Oh, you get a book like Hebrews, and Hebrews is probably the most complex book in the New Testament documents. But you begin reading things like this, our translations don't even begin to bring out the power and flavor, and there's figurativism, right, of these documents. I mean, consider people writing, especially in the Greek worldview. What is this obviously touching on? The worldviews of the Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, and the Egyptians. The Egyptians were big into this. And one of the reasons I wanted to look up the Egyptian parts of the soul was because we will see bits and pieces of that throughout the Old and New Testament. Matter of fact, you do, right? Because what's the first thing that happens to Moses when he meets God? What does God do? Remember the first? He gave him his name. He said, I am. That's the first time that God is named in the Old Testament, and it was right after he came out of Egypt. And the reason that was important is because that is an Egyptian worldview concept that was absorbed by the Hebrews. And we even see it. Well, we'll see it in these. 6. 6. The translation, they near fall to restore a new reversal of thoughts, and up impale on a stake themselves the Son of God and near exhibit a public example. In other words, those who are not accepting and who had become part of their group but who were not able to accept it, they near fall to restore a new reversal of their thoughts, and they impale on a stake themselves. This is the one where it says, they put Christ on the cross again. And I told you, I didn't think that was necessarily a negative example. Right? Think about it. Even if you have failing Christians who, by their actions, are putting Christ back up on the cross, what at least is happening? That is being expressed in the community. And that's the point of this writing. The point of this writing is, remember, give the worldview about the Hebrews' idea, the logos to telos, about the Jewish thought and between hodos in such a way that it's understandable to all these groups. And it mainly comes out of that Jewish kind of worldview. 7, as the earth that imbibes in showers, often coming on it, and that produces grazing plants well placed to those for whom tilled amid takes the good arguments off God. In other words, he's saying that just the actions, it becomes a very complicated argument, but it's very easy to see that he's saying that even when people are searching, right? What does that do for the community? It's like grazing plants that have been planted just by the nature of the winds right? And what happens? God puts puts the reins on it and allows it to grow, and then it becomes grazing stock, right? And what kind of work did you have to do? None at all. So his point is that, and I think to make this very simple, remember we're talking about, remember when it said before this, in the previous chapter, I made the comment, I said, what this is saying is to the Hebrews, to the Jewish people that got this letter. If you don't understand this, who should you go to? Your Greek neighbors. Your neighbors who understand the language, right? Because even the writers are saying, this Greek may be complex for you, but if you go to your neighbors, then what happens with your neighbors? They're getting the message too. I think what he is saying, and I think what this is talking about is and I'm not, and I don't think he's giving us a Calvinistic viewpoint. The Calvinistic viewpoint is you don't do anything, right? And those who say to me saved, and those who aren't saved. You're toast. What's the Jewish viewpoint in proselytizing? The Jewish viewpoint is, okay, we go and we train you, and you memorize the Torah, and after you've memorized the Torah, we'll test you, we'll give you your bar mitzvah, and then if you're really good, we'll let you do the mikvah, and you've got to go through all these trials, and finally circumcision, right? All this stuff you got to do, right? But they were selling their product. They were selling their product like crazy in the ancient world because people were looking for something. Christianity, Teen Hodos came in, and Teen Hodos said, what?
Everybody's welcome to learn, and it's not that hard to convert.
Yeah, and we'll even tell you the mystery of faith right up front. You don't have to wait for 40 years. You don't have to go through all this stuff, right? You don't have to learn the secret handshake and go through the initiations until you're finally teetering on the brink of death, and they whisper in your ear, the secret is, right? So Teen Hodos was right out front, right in there. And what he's saying is he's not saying it's automatic, but he's saying simply by communicating and talking and interacting with your neighbors, then what happens to the gospel? It's spread. Just by you inviting people to your services, to synagogue, to whatever the Teen Hodos events were going on. And you know why this is so important? Remember I told you, these people are in diaspora. You've got Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and Jews. And they're all people coming in. What is the tendency when you have a group like that? Groups like that.
To stay within your own enclave.
Yeah, to stay, like, Chinatown, right? Or the Jewish sector, or, right, the different sectors in areas in New York City, or what they're saying is, look, go to your neighbors, interact with the people there, invite them. Don't create your cliques, don't create these groups, and just interact. And, that's what he means by that. As a matter of fact, and we're starting in 8 here, and 8 is one of the more complicated. These are all very complicated, but at least we're going to dig in for 8, because like I said, that's where we stopped before. And I had all kinds of, in fact, I gave you those about 7. 7 and 8. Got a bazillion Old Testament analogies or quotes from there. I finally get to it. Let's see. We did this at 7 before. Now we're on 8. But land. Let's see. The land that was all added. It says but to bear out. Epphiro. But to bear out. To bear out a thorn and thistles. Literally a tribulus. I almost gave you tribulus because that's a crowfoot. A tribulus is what you use against cavalry and against, you can use them against infantry as well. But it's basically a callop, a piece of metal or a piece, usually not metal, they make them out of wood. This is what they do in their spare time, is they carve these out of wood. But you lay these down, and what happens when the horses or men step on them? Spike them. Yeah, especially good against horses. It's called a tribulus, a crowfoot, but it comes from thorn also. Worthless, not approved, and is in danger of literally aegis. Aegis, near enough to hold, near enough to grab by the throat, literally is what aegis means. Cursed, down prayer. In the end, the telos, the end point, it will be burned. So let's see this again. But, land that, it doesn't say land that, it says but, produces thorns. In other words, the grace, when you are expressing the gospel or talking to people about God, right? What will that give you? Free grazing land, right? But if you don't, what does that give you? Thorns and thistles. As a matter of fact, thorns and thistles, an impediment to the gospel. So I think it specifically says, but bears out a thorn and a crowfoot, not approved, and near enough to hold down prayer, literally prayers of curses or malediction. The telos, the point, aim as a limit for burning. So in other words, I know what he's saying to us. What the author is trying to tell us is that what do communities almost always worry about? What does our community worry about all the time about faith?
Our children falling away?
Well, yeah, I don't disagree with that. I would say the dilution of our faith. What comes up all the time? People say, oh, you're bringing modern music into the church, right? You're diluting the message. You bring in new ideas. As long as those ideas are not sinful or wrong, sometimes they'll say you're diluting. If you're doing a different type of service, right? Instead of, we don't even do the 1400 services. We're even way outside of that box, right? But when you bring in a new service and a new service book, people say, oh, that's new. I can't do that, right? Usually when you have these groups like denominations, the biggest concern by the denomination is the dilution of their views or ideas. What do you think the authors of Hebrews is trying to tell us? What happens when you stay in your enclave? Thorns and thistles, right? What happens when you spread out and communicate basically the ideas? Even if and I think he means even if you're not totally founded or settled in your own thoughts, right? The most important thing is communicating, not holding it in. Because by communicating, you present it to others. And by the way, I think, you say one of our big worries is children falling away. Children will be falling away if they are constrained without understanding.
Yeah, because then they're susceptible to being pulled away by the other arguments or things they've never heard before.
Right.
Or they've never been taught anything from the outside, or why do we believe what we believe as compared to all these other things?
See, some people would say that teaching a class like this, I bring in Soitnus and Josephus and the Mishnah and the Tanakh, and I talk about the Jewish documents and the history. Oh, God forbid, you might get some funny ideas in your mind about that, right? If you bring in all that information. I say the exact opposite. By bringing in that information, I'm hoping that it solidifies your views, and at the same time opens your brain to what God's views are, right? I don't think God does not have a mind that's, his mind is so open that his brain slip out, right? That's the old joke. God is firmly fixed and knows, and they're permanent. They don't change. He's unchanging, right? But yet our problem is what? We change, but we're fully constrained in our brains. The most important thing is what do we become? You become so, how open-minded do you think the Antifa guys are? Right?
Not at all.
And they're supposed to be the Berkeley liberal free speechers, right? What happened? You see?
Because they refuse to hear anything else besides what they want to hear. Like, they need their safe space, and if they hear anything offensive that's horrible, they don't want to hear. All they want to hear is this teeny little thing they already agree with.
American television.
Yeah.
American Talbot. Well, yeah, but you notice, see, that's what the author's talking about, right? When you constrain within your groups, you become, you're building thistles, you're building caltrops, right? You can't move forward. You can't do anything. On the other hand, when you're bringing out the ideas, you can. And there's a number of, I don't know if I'll be able to get to many of them, but you can see the examples here. For example, from Genesis 17, Genesis 3:17. To Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat it all of the days of your life. And by the way, this is the proof text, and I didn't do the Hebrew, but who did God tell not to eat the fruit? Told Adam. Didn't tell Eve. Eve could eat it all day.
That's right.
It wasn't to Adam. And by the way, the Jews believe that very sincerely, that Eve did not sin. Eve was not under that commandment. Although she was given a travail because she tempted her husband, even though she probably knew she wasn't supposed to. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? But she did not, she got special dispensation in Jewish thought, and is, of course, a higher being. I think it's kind of interesting. But it's funny because it fits within the context of this work. We'll continue from there. That's probably a good place. I will not be here next week, but I will be here the week after that. I'm going to Bahrain, so I'm going to fly an airplane.
You can be here Thursday?
No, I'm leaving Wednesday.
Just real quick, to me it occurs that this is like a direct allusion to the parable of the sower.
It could be, and that's worth talking about. So hold that thought, because we usually don't. Remember, we could play this game well because we're 70 AD, right? Mm-hmm. So they may know this because they may have the other documents. So keep that in your brain, and I'll put a note myself, and we'll yak about that. Thank you, Father, for your word. I pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray, amen.
Glad you're here.